Good evening. I'm Shin, Director of Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford University. It's really my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2020 Shorenstein Journalism Award ceremony. This is our 19th annual award celebration and the first fully virtual one. Actually, last year, we had about half a virtual event with a recipient speaking from Manila online. And I hope that you are keeping well despite all the challenges that we face these days. So almost 20 years ago, in 2002, our center and Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy established this Shorenstein Journalism Award to honor the legacy of Mr. Walter Shorenstein and his twin patients, promoting excellence in journalism and understanding of Asia. A philanthropist and visionary businessman, Walter was more than a benefactor to our center. He was our mentor and companion. We miss him greatly. We are also very grateful for the continued support of the Shorenstein family. The Shorenstein Awards, now solely sponsored by APAC at Stanford, can recognize accomplished journalists who have significantly contributed to a greater understanding of the complexity of Asia and to communicate their insight to audiences around the world. Since 2011, the award has alternated between recipients whose work has mostly been conveyed through American news media and recipients who have communicated their work mainly through Asian news media. This year, we are recognizing an honoree in the former category. Our past awardees include, just to name few, Ian Johnson, a veteran journalist focused on Chinese society history, Anna Fifield, the Washington Post, former Beijing and Tokyo bureau chief, and our last year's honoree, the internationally esteemed and brave champion of press freedom, Maria Risa, founder and executive and editor of the Philippine news platform, Republic. So tonight, we are very delighted to recognize a true veteran of Asia reporting, Tom Wright, who over the past 25 years has worked mainly in South and Southeast Asian countries, and whose investigation and reportings have repeatedly unveiled the complicity of Western institutions in the affliction of corruption in the area. Tom's reporting on the multi-billion-dollar looting of the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, one Malaysian development Berhad, one of the largest financial scandal in history, has made a tremendous impact, and that's the focus of tonight's discussion. So we are very much looking forward to hearing from Tom about the inside story behind this scandal and its aftermath. So then following Tom's keynote, we will be joined by Meredith Weiss, professor and chair of political science at the University of Albany, who will lead a conversation with Tom. We will then close our tonight's program with audience Q&A session, which will be led by my colleague, Dan Emerson, who's heading our Southeast Asia program. So as usual, we invite you to submit your questions to Tom and Meredith throughout the evening via the Zoom Q&A and function. Okay, now I'm pleased to invite my colleague at Stanford, Jay Hamilton, to introduce our award recipient. Jay is the Hearst Professor of Communication and Chair of the Department of Communication and Director of the Journalism Program at Stanford University. And Jay is the co-founder of the Stanford Computational Journalism Lab, also a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and also member of Knight Fellowship Board of Visitors. He also serves as a member of our selection committee for the Shorenstein Journalism Award. So before Jay introduces our honoree tonight, I'd like to extend my deep appreciation to our entire selection committee, which include 4 other experts. Here with us online tonight is Raju Narusetti, Global Publishing Director in McKinsey & Corporation, and 3 other members who couldn't join tonight, but Wendy Cutler, Vice President and Managing Director, Washington, D.C. office, Asia Society Policy Institute, and Philip Pan, Weekend Editor and former Asia Editor of the New York Times, and Prasen Parameswaran, Director of Bauer Group Asia and Senior Columnist, The Diplomat. So now I'm happy to turn to Jay. Jay?
Thank you very much. It is a true pleasure to celebrate tonight the awarding of the 2020 Shorenstein Journalism Award for excellence in the coverage of the Asia-Pacific region to Tom Wright. This is a Career Achievement Award recognizing stellar reporting done over a period of 25 years, mainly in South and Southeast Asia. Wright's work represents the essence of accountability journalism. We often think of investigative reporters as lone wolves or irascible rebels, but they do have their own association, investigative reporters and editors. IRE defines investigative journalism as the reporting through one's own initiative and work product of matters of importance to readers, viewers, or listeners. In many cases, the subjects of the reporting wish the matters under scrutiny to remain undisclosed. Tom Wright's reporting perfectly fits that textbook definition. He takes the time, often enumerated in months or years, to discover facts about how institutions are operating. When his work is published, the world changes. Debates ensue, individuals lose jobs or an election, and policies are corrected. And there are a set of people, often in Asian governments and Western financial institutions, who wish they'd done a better job of keeping their corruption secret. The best investigative reporters start honing their crafts early. In the months before he started covering Watergate, Bob Woodward had more front-page stories about problems with local governments or companies than any of the 60 other journalists on the Washington Post Metro staff. Tonight, we'll be discussing Tom Wright's path-breaking coverage of the 1MDB scandal, for which he and others at the Wall Street Journal won a Loeb Award and were finalists for a Pulitzer Prize. But Tom Wright excelled at investigative work long before that story. For example, in 2008, his reporting demonstrated how an Indian wind turbine company was hiding defects in its technology, which led the firm's share prices to plummet. In 2011, he broke new ground reporting about the Obama administration's multi-billion-dollar civilian aid program in Pakistan. In 2013, he led Wall Street Journal coverage of a factory disaster in Bangladesh that resulted in more than 1,000 deaths. This award-winning reporting detailed how garment makers kept costs down by ignoring plant safety violations. And in 2015, Wright started investigating the 1MDB scandal, which has been described as, quote, an almost unbelievable series of events in which bankers at Goldman Sachs helped a young Malaysian financier steal at least $4 billion from Malaysian state fund 1MDB, one of the largest financial frauds of all time. The multi-year investigation showed the degree to which Western institutions, from Wall Street banks, law firms, auditors, and even Hollywood film companies, will turn a blind eye to malfeasance in the pursuit of profits. Wright has co-written with Bradley Hope a cinematic book about this entitled Billion Dollar Whale, The Man Who Fooled Wall Street, Hollywood, and the World. This is a product placement for that book. People will enjoy this book for many different reasons. Fans of accountability reporting will appreciate that the journalism described here sparked investigations by law enforcement and regulators in 6 countries. One person praised the book as wonderful read, thrilling, and we know that sentiment because that reader happened to be Bill Gates. As a journalism professor, I especially appreciated that Tom Wright spent a long time wading through hundreds of Excel spreadsheets containing WhatsApp transcripts to, quote, find the best bits, the diamond in the rough that would be the scene or character trait that we would put on the book. This is a story that continues to evolve with news this week that I will defer to Tom Wright to talk about. You know, millions of people have read or been affected by Tom Wright's work. We can't fit them all on Zoom tonight, so instead, Professor Shin and I will be their stand-ins to honor his work. Professor Shin would now like to present Tom with the 2020 Shorenstein Journalism Award.
Okay, here, Tom, it's really our pleasure to present to you with this award for this year. So I wish we could do it in person, but then congratulations and thank you for your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Jiwook. This is, thank you to the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center as well. This is really a highlight of my career. As you said, I've been a journalist for 25 years, and I was lucky enough to have my career with the Wall Street Journal, which is a fabulous newspaper that really gives the time to journalists to do investigative reporting. I worked with some great editors and reporters there, Paul Beckett, Ken Brown, Patrick Barter, and the co-author of my book, Bradley Hope. The paper really is a place where team effort counts for all, and that's how we get the job done at the Journal. You mentioned Maria Ressa, and I want to just very quickly talk about that. Obviously, she's facing huge pressure in the Philippines right now just for doing her job. And I commend Stanford for recognizing journalism at this important time when the profession really is under pressure in so many places. You know, I don't think we should take press freedom for granted. I certainly don't. And yeah, thanks again for this award. As I said, it's really a highlight of my career so far. Anyway, tonight for you guys and this morning for me here in Hong Kong, I'd like to talk about Billion Dollar Whale. So I don't know how many of you on this call know the story, so I'm going to give a quick précis of it, but I'm also going to focus more on how the hell this could happen. This is an incredible story, one that shouldn't have happened. It shows the complicity of Western financial institutions, banks, auditors, and many others and governments around the world. I'm also going to talk about how we uncovered it at the Journal. And how journalism and authorities interact, and how important that is for fraud to come to light. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about lessons learned from this and what could happen going forward. But as yesterday's news about Goldman shows, I don't think many lessons have been learned so far. So this is a photo that I call peak Jolo. This is Jolo, the fraudster at the center of the 1MDB scandal, being greeted here by the beautiful model Gigi Hadid. And you can see all the faces behind. Everyone is lauding this guy for giving millions of dollars to a Wall Street charity. This is a charity ball on Wall Street. He is at the height of this is 2014, he's at the height of his career. He's dating Australian supermodel Miranda Kerr. He's just put in a bid to buy Reebok from Adidas. His film, The Wolf of Wall Street, has just come out. But there's a big, huge secret that nobody in this room knows or has bothered to find out about, And that's that not 1 cent of this guy's money was earned. It was all stolen from a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund called 1MDB. So how did Jolo get to that point? Here he is, marked in red. This is in the 1990s. He's in middle school in Penang. Penang is an island off of the northwest coast of Malaysia. Jolo grew up in a millionaire's family. His dad was in the garment business. Now, Jolo probably didn't want to be a fraudster at this age. As we tried to work out his character, we realized that all of this happened without planning. But he did have one great advantage over most of us if he were to become a fraudster, and that was that his father was a fraudster. Larry Lowe had stolen millions of dollars from his business partner in Penang, and Larry Lowe knew all about offshore finance. He had accounts in the British Virgin Islands and the Seychelles and elsewhere where he sent money around. And Jolo's sister was a lawyer with a speciality in the British Virgin Islands. And so Jolo was born into a family that knew about this world of offshore finance, which would be so important in his fraud. Jolo's second great advantage was that his family wanted him to enter the world of the 0.01%, the world's very, very richest. We're talking about billionaires and people worth hundreds of millions. And so his father and mother sent him in 1998 for his high school leaving exams to Harrow School in the UK, one of the world's most elite boarding schools, where he got to know this guy's stepson, this is Najib Razak, and this is his wife, Roswell Mansour. Najib at the time was Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, an extremely corrupt individual. Even before the 1MDB scandal, he had helped to steal millions of dollars when he was a defense minister through a defense contracting deal. And Jolo got to know his stepson while he was in England. He also got to know the Sultan of Brunei's son and others. So he was vaulted into that world of the 0.01%. This is Roswell Mansour. I love this photo. She has a sort of Napoleonic look. It's almost like a 19th century photo. Anyway, she will go down in history as one of the world's most corrupt people. When they raided her house at the end of all of this, a couple of years ago, they found $250 million of loose items in her house in Kuala Lumpur. This is like cash, jewelry, Birkin bags and the like. Just incredible. So in 2000, Jolo graduates from high school and goes to Wharton College in the US for his undergraduate degree in economics. Now, he doesn't really care too much about studying. He's a quick enough study, he can pass his exams. But what he really wants to do is network. And he takes a semester off from Wharton, where he travels to the Middle East. And all of his Middle Eastern contacts from school and from Wharton set him up with meetings in the Middle East so he can get better connected. And don't forget, this is a guy who's just in college, but he's already looking ahead to how he can do business. And he gets to know this guy. This is Prince Turki. He was the 7th son of the then Saudi king. And he also goes to Jolo also goes to the United Arab Emirates, and he meets a bunch of very senior Emirati business people and leaders. And you may think this is amazing, and it is amazing. He was only a college student. And what Jolo learns is that in these places, the boundary between private and public wealth is extremely flimsy. There's huge gray areas, and that there were people in their early 30s managing these sovereign wealth funds of public money that Arab countries were using to buy up, vaunted American companies, Virgin Galactic, for example, Daimler-Benz in Europe. And I think that plants a seed in Jolo's mind that he would like to have that kind of pot of wealth at his disposal if he could manage to do something like that in Malaysia. Anyway, he graduates from Wharton, and what he decides to do is to act as a broker for money flowing from the Middle East to Malaysia, where he has his contacts, of course, with the Deputy Prime Minister, Najib Razak. He acts as a typical broker, just taking a cut from deals, from money flowing, and that's quite a typical thing in Asia. It's a little bit corrupt, but not half as corrupt as what he was to get up to in the next few years. This fraud would not have happened without a very lucky break for Jolo, and that is that Najib Razak, pictured here in the white shirt, becomes Prime Minister of Malaysia in 2009, and Jolo is his right-hand man, or his Svengali. This is a photo taken on a super yacht off Saint-Tropez in 2009, shortly after Najib became Prime Minister. Prince Turki, who you saw in the earlier slide, is wearing the baseball cap, and this is Roswell Mansour, looking a little less regal, and the Najib family. Jolo persuades Najib to set up a sovereign wealth fund, which they call 1MDB. And 1MDB is supposed to improve the lives of average Malaysians, which is, still, fairly poor country. It's stuck in the middle income trap. The fund is supposed to create jobs in new energy, green energy, that kind of thing. But instead, it's used as a pot of money for Najib so he can get reelected. And obviously, Malaysian money politics is incredibly corrupt. Now, that was one reason why Najib allowed the fund to be set up. And Jolo also sets up a joint venture with Prince Turki. And the whole point of that joint venture was just to steal money. They were supposed, 1MDB, which Jolo ran from behind the scenes, was supposed to do oil ventures with Prince Turki's company. But instead, the money was simply stolen. Now, there are supposed to be checks and balances in the global financial system. If you send money, if you or I send money around from bank to bank, banks will check to see whether we've met compliance. So how was Jolo able to steal, in this first part of the fraud, $1 billion? Well, the reason is he hid behind government-to-government transactions. Even though Prince Turki's company was private, he pretended to Deutsche Bank, which was the bank on this trade, and to KPMG, the auditors of the 1MDB accounts, that this was all government-to-government business. And for that, they let these transactions through, even though the money was sent off to a Seychelles company owned by Jolo. Another reason they let it happen, of course, was that everyone was making a lot of money. Jolo in 2009 had $1 billion. This wasn't a Ponzi scheme like Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff lost $18 billion through his 40-year pyramid scheme that came to light in 2008. But Madoff's take was much, much smaller than that 18 billion because other investors were paid off. Jolo had a very, very small number of co-conspirators, and so he had a lot of money, probably the most liquid person on the planet in 2009. Well, what did he want to do with it? Well, he wanted to get to know Paris Hilton at first. Here she is with him on a boat in France. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars a night on her, attending parties and casinos. And at one point, he gave her $250,000 in casino chips. He paid, Jamie Foxx to turn up to just MC for a few hours, and these guys would get $500,000, that kind of thing. Well, he's really frittering away this first billion. He buys a Bombardier global jet so he can fly around the world. This is a photo we got exclusively. He bought this house in Belgravia in London for around 30 million pounds for Najib and Rosmer to hang out. And this was quite close to Harrods, which was good for them to go shopping. And he became the largest nightclub and casino whale the world has ever known. He would drop $50,000 worth of chips on the floor by mistake and people would pick them up. If you happened to knock into him, your life could be changed. If he liked you, he might give you a Chanel bag worth $50,000 or chips worth $200,000. This is what was going on in 2009 and 2010. He single-handedly made a nightclub empire called Marquee Group or the Tao Group. They were successful before Jolo came along, but Jolo became their biggest client, spending millions and millions of dollars, and they arranged a lot of his parties before they got sold to Madison Square Gardens a couple of years ago. By 2012, Jolo and his co-conspirators in Saudi Arabia, in this case, and in Switzerland, have frittered away a lot of that money. The Department of Justice shows just how much they frittered away. This guy here is called Tim Leisner. He was a former partner at Goldman Sachs. Leisner, who was based in Hong Kong and Singapore, had been sniffing around Jolo for a couple of years, seeing how much money the 1MDB fund had and how it was investing it and making, it seemed to be a very, very good client for Goldman. And Leisner gets in with Jolo, and Goldman raises $6.5 billion worth of bonds for the 1MDB fund in 2012 and 2013. Interest rates were very, very low at the time. Pension funds were eager for these kind of bonds. And Goldman makes an astounding $600 million of profit selling those bonds, which is around 200 times what the fees should have been. Now, of course, this was because Jolo wanted to raise money quickly and quietly and was almost paying off Goldman for this to happen expeditiously without too many questions. Leisner has pleaded guilty in the US to helping Jolo steal $200 million of that money. But Goldman says it could not have known that Leisner, the man pictured here, would go rogue and would do that. And I'll talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about Goldman because there was some news yesterday about its settlement with the Department of Justice. But for now, we'll move on with the presentation. Those bonds that, that 1MDB raised with Goldman, the 6.5 billion, astoundingly, half of it was stolen, 3 billion. And the way that Jolo did that was he had a joint venture with a United Arab Emirates sovereign wealth fund, exactly the kind of fund that he had seen when he was at Wharton and was trying to emulate. And 1MDB and this UAE fund were in on this together. The CEO of the UAE fund was also a fraudster called Kadim Al-Kabaisi. And so they stole the money. Instead of sending money that they were supposed to use the Goldman bonds to buy power plants and to do certain investments, they just stole it and they sent the money into lookalike companies that were in the Caribbean. So companies that looked like the sovereign wealth fund of the UAE, but were actually privately held by all of these fraudsters. Some of that money in 2012, Jolo at this point is starting to think, well, I better build some businesses here because I'm going to have to put money back into 1MDB at some point. And so they put the money into a film company called Red Granite Pictures, which goes on to make The Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio. Jolo gets very close to DiCaprio. He gives him Picasso paintings, Diane Arbus photographs, Basquiat paintings. And he offers Jolo, DiCaprio and Scorsese $400 million in film financing. That's enough to make 4 big budget films. After The Wolf of Wall Street, they were going to go on to make The Irishman and other films. This is Miranda Kerr, the Australian supermodel. In 2014, she had just split from Orlando Bloom, her husband, and she meets Jolo in a Korean restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, and they begin to date. Jolo was offered to help her IPO her skincare line, Cora Organics, and that was one of the reasons she was attracted to him. And I should say they date for a year. This is the Time Warner Center in New York City. Jolo moves into the former apartment of Jay-Z and Beyonce in the penthouse there. He becomes one of the largest, if not the largest, purchaser of modern art or any kind of art. He pays $40 million plus for this Basquiat, a record at the time. He pays $250 million for this yacht, the Equanimity, which he has built. Equanimity meaning composure in a difficult situation. And just as he buys the yacht, the situation was going to get a lot more difficult for him. So how did Jolo's scandal unravel? He first steals money in 2009, and he continues through unhindered until 2015. He's stolen $4 or $5 billion of money, which is just an incredible amount for one individual with a few co-conspirators to get away with. I always say that this fraud is probably the last one that will be conducted on email. If you're going to do a fraud, you're much better off doing it in person or on an encrypted messaging app. But these guys wrote a lot of stuff down in emails. This guy is Ketat Ho. He's a publisher of The Edge newspaper in Malaysia. And The Edge and the Sarawak Report, a British website, got hold of the email servers of Petro Saudi. That's the Saudi company involved in the first part of the fraud, owned by Prince Turki. A disgruntled employee of Petro Saudi knew about the fraud and wanted some payment, and he didn't get it. And so instead, he took the email servers and he sold them to Ketat here and to the Sarawak Report. And the emails painted a picture of what had gone on in that first part of the fraud in 2009. At the Wall Street Journal, we got involved in the middle of 2015 when part of the Malaysian government that knew that Najib Razak, the prime minister, had taken $1 billion into his personal bank account, leaked us documents about those bank accounts and his credit cards and the like. And that's how we got involved. This guy is Yusuf Al Otaiba. He is the sitting current UAE ambassador to Washington. He's a pretty prominent figure in Washington. He's often on cable news shows. And he's seen as very pro-Western, anti-Al-Qaeda, anti-ISIS. He also had a secret, and that was that he was a big promoter of Jolo. He had opened doors for Jolo in the United Arab Emirates, where he is an extremely connected person. And in return, Otaiba was paid millions of dollars of 1MDB money that Jolo layered through various accounts. Otaiba was aware of that Jolo was dodgy. He even asked whether he should help him get an account at Goldman and the like. And they tried to keep his relationship with Jolo secret. He's still the ambassador to Washington. We know about all of this because his emails got hacked by the Qataris. Otaiba was an architect of the blockade of Qatar, and the Qataris don't like him very much. And we were able to show that those emails were bona fide. We also got hold of the email servers of Red Granite Pictures, that's the film company. This is a photo from the night in our book Billion Dollar Whale called An Evening with the Playmates. The phone book of the emails was stuffed with Playboy Playmates phone numbers, and we cold called a lot of these Playmates. And Jolo would use them, hire them to come to events to try to lure in businessmen. And this event here was an event where DiCaprio attended, along with Jolo and a couple of other guys in the Palazzo Hotel in Vegas. And this is when Jolo was trying to get to know DiCaprio and to lure him into his crime. I should say DiCaprio wasn't aware, I don't think, that there was a crime going on, but he was getting money for films. So for about a year from our reporting at the Journal in 2015 until the middle of 2016, Najib and Jolo called us liars. They said we were making it all up. And then in 2016, in the summer, the Department of Justice made its first move. This is former Attorney General Loretta Lynch on the podium announcing that they were acting to seize about what would become about $2 billion in assets in the US that Jolo and others had bought with the stolen money. And it was actually, the lawsuit was actually called the US versus the Wolf of Wall Street, because they tried to get the proceeds of the Wolf of Wall Street back, and they did so. The US is trying to say this is a civil action, not a criminal action. And the US was saying, look, if you're a global kleptocrat, don't come and try to buy assets in the US. Obviously, kleptocrats need to get money out of their poorly governed states like Malaysia and into the US. And the US allows far too much of this money to flow in. And so that's the Global Kleptocracy Act that the DOJ passed as an attempt to try to stop that. Since then, there's been a number, this is 4 years ago now, there's been a number of developments. One is that Najib Razak lost an election in Malaysia, was subsequently arrested, and he has been jailed for 12 years. He apparently is able to continue to campaign in Malaysia while he's out on appeal, which is astounding to me, but that's what's going on in Malaysia. Now, as I said, I was going to talk about Goldman. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Goldman has reached a settlement. It's not official yet, but the Journal is reporting that the Goldman has reached a $2.8 billion settlement with the Department of Justice for its role in this scandal. But astoundingly, in my view, Goldman has not had to plead guilty at a parent company level. Only its Singapore subsidiary will plead guilty. And this is just typical. After the subprime crisis in 2008, 2007, 2008, very few bankers went to jail. And there were these deferred prosecution agreements where you basically admit wrongdoing, but not criminal liability. And that's exactly what's happened in this case, if the Journal story is correct. The fines levied by Malaysia, which was about 2.5 billion plus this latest fine, take the fines to Goldman to about $5 billion. That's about 2/3 of its annual profit. You could argue that that's a deterrent, but I don't think so. Jim Cramer on CNBC yesterday was saying, oh, this is great, Goldman's got this behind it. It's just had a record profit quarter. So I don't think any of this is going to deter the kind of behavior that we've seen in the $1 billion whale case, the enabling behavior of Western financial institutions. And then another huge question is, well, where is Jolo? Well, he is in China. We know that for sure. He's protected by the Chinese government. He says he did nothing wrong, but he is yet to come to America or to anywhere or to Malaysia to see justice. And I think I'll leave that for our discussion that we're going to do after this presentation with Meredith. So that's the story. And I just like to finish this with one last thought. I think that, we're seeing democracy challenged around the world. And I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but having spent so long on this, I feel very strongly that this kind of enabling behavior by Western institutions in foreign countries with poor rule of law is one of the reasons why democracy is so badly rooted in these places. It's not just Malaysia. You've got Angola, you've got Credit Suisse and its Mozambique scandals, you've got the whole state capture in South Africa. And Western institutions need to be held accountable for their actions in these places. That's my final thought. So thank you again for this award. It's a fantastic thing to have received. And I look forward to your questions and discussing more with Meredith.
Well, that was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And my job is to try to prepare for a conversation between you, Tom, and our discussant, Meredith Weiss. I'm Don Emerson. I run the Southeast Asia program, as Giwuk mentioned at the beginning of our session. As both a fellow scholar and a friend of Meredith Weiss, I'm doubly happy to introduce her. As Giwuk mentioned, she is a professor in the State University of New York in Albany, where she chairs the Department of Political Science at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy. She has held fellowships and research positions at many institutions, including universities in Australia, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and the United States. Her latest book, published this year, is about party machines and grassroots politics in Southeast Asia. Her many previous publications include more than a dozen authored, edited, or co-edited volumes, including one that is particularly relevant to our conversation today, namely The Political Logics of Anti-Corruption Efforts in Asia, published last year. Professor Weiss's degrees include a PhD from Yale and a BA from Rice. So Meredith, the screen and the microphone are yours.
Hey, thanks so much, Don, and my sincere congratulations, Tom, on an award very well deserved. I am delighted to have the chance to grill you some more about this case and others. And so I'll jump right in. So we've just learned, as you note, of a new settlement with Goldman Sachs, and cases are slowly working their way through the courts, even in Malaysia. Do any of the penalties fit the crimes, at least thus far?
Well, I don't think so. As I said, I mean, I feel like you need criminal sanction at the high level, at the C-suite level here, because if you don't get that, what's really the cost? You could say, I mean, people will debate this. I'll say 2/3 of the year's profit for Goldman is a deterrent. Also, you know, they've had 5 years of bad press as well in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. And that's, you know, Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman, when he retired a couple of years ago, he had his pay suspended. His options were held back over the completion of this. I'm sure they'll be paid out now. But I just don't see it as a deterrent. And also, we should point out that this settlement is happening just weeks ahead of an election,
Yes.
with an administration which is stuffed with former Goldman employees, including the Treasury Secretary.
So 2 follow-ups on that. The first is, will Jolo escape the net?
It's possible. So we should explain, I suppose, a little bit to listeners why China would be protecting him, right? Should I do that? Yeah. I mean, it's a very complicated story, but after the first stories came out about Jolo in 2015, Najib told him to go to China. He's ethnically Chinese. He's a Chuchao Chinese. And he was able to live in China with the protection of Najib, almost as if he was a government emissary to China. And China saw a possibility to turn Malaysia into a client state at the time, because Najib was on the rocks. He was facing prosecution for criminal activity. And so they reached deals with Malaysia through Jolo at that time to do corrupt infrastructure deals in Malaysia. And so that's why Jolo knows all about those corrupt infrastructure deals. And that's why he would be given protection in China today.
Right, and you mentioned the upcoming election here. And there are these really intriguing and weird ties with US politics, and specifically with the RNC and with Donald Trump. Have oscillations in US politics, or perhaps just ahead, shaped the course of this case? I mean, has that really spurred or slowed some of the investigations? How do you see those connections?
Well, there was a fear when Trump came to power. He said, if you remember, that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the way that you hold American companies to account for their actions in other countries like Malaysia, he said that this was a nuisance and this was stopping business. But Jolo mounted from China an extraordinary campaign to stop the Department of Justice's investigation into all of this, which failed. So Trump did not, there's no evidence that Trump actually intervened with anyone to stop the investigations. I mean, he may have tried, I don't know, but there's no evidence of that. Again, just yesterday, Elliot Broidy, who was the Republican National Committee's vice chairman of finance, pleaded guilty to, and people who don't know this story think this part is made up, pleaded guilty to accepting millions and millions of dollars from Jolo to try to influence Trump to drop the case. And he's pleaded guilty to doing that without announcing himself as a representative of a foreign agent. And so all of this stuff is still playing out. And by the way, Pras Michel, the rapper from the Fugees band from the 1990s, is also involved in that effort to stop the Department of Justice probes, because he was a friend of Jolo's. So it has got tangled up in politics, but yeah, Jolo doesn't seem to have been successful.
How many times in investigating to the story did you think this can't possibly be true? There must be a mistake here.
Well, I mean, you know, as a journalist, I feel very lucky that the story came across, you know, our desk, because there are very few stories. Like our book, for example, has popped up again on Amazon because of the Goldman settlement. There's very few nonfiction stories that you can report, and they're not just historical. The fact that this is actually still happening in real time is very interesting. But it also speaks to whether America is going, you know, whether Jolo is going to be able to be brought to justice anywhere. I think that's the most important piece of this that's still missing. Right.
What remaining mystery in the case frustrates you the most?
It's not so much a mystery, but I think from a presentation, I find it very annoying that Yusuf Al Otaiba continues to swan around Washington, going to, you know, diplomatic dinners. He's, you know, he was quoted in a journal story just yesterday about his role in the UAE Israel peace deal. You know, there are certain people in this world who are just protected by their status, by their access to the 0.01%. And unless we sort of deal with that kind of problem, the corruption that we're talking about is just going to continue, because there can't be justice for certain people.
Right. And indeed, you trace in your reporting and in the book a system in which there are controls and questions were asked, but somehow this brash young guy could simply bluff and dazzle his way through as part of this moneyed, entitled global cohort who do much the same. And one of the things that's really striking, especially, is how much these investigations make clear how not unique 1MDB is, except in its sheer scale and in just the crazy details, like the fact of Joe Low. So what's the bigger picture? What would be your top tips for regulators to fix this? Or what's the bigger picture for corruption, especially in Asia? Will any of this really help to plug some of the gaps? Or do you see this now as business as usual and we just wait for the next even bigger whale to come along?
Well, I see it as business as usual. It's a great question. I don't think you can get much bigger than this, perhaps. But you know, there's a book called Sabotage that just came out from a professor in the City University in London, which basically says that banking is predicated on these kind of deals. Now, some people would say, well, I don't understand banking and I don't cover banking all the time. That's true. But I do think if you're a partner at Goldman Sachs, like Tim Leisner was, and you're you know, banging around Southeast Asia, it's very, very hard, or even China, it's very, very hard to find deals that are big enough to justify your partner status and your big bonuses. And so how do you get those deals and make sure that they're not corrupt? That would be the question. And so, yes, I do think this will happen again. And like I mentioned in the presentation, you know, look at Angola, where the president's daughter was involved in all kinds of corruption and all kinds of foreign institutions were involved. Look at Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse was involved in this crazy thing called the tuna boat scandal in Mozambique, where they lent $2 billion to the Mozambique government to buy tuna fishing boats, and it was stolen. And Credit Suisse bankers have been indicted in that case. A very senior Goldman banker who was involved with Jolo in the Middle East, called Hazem Shawki, has left Goldman. He hasn't been sanctioned, and he's joined Credit Suisse. So I'm just very pessimistic about whether anything will change in the long run. Especially when, another question is that the gatekeepers, you know, are the people involved themselves. So auditors are paid by their clients, you know. So how's that going to ever work out?
Right. At least on a small scale, have you seen any positive changes since or resulting from 1MDB?
Yes, there are a few. So for example, there's been pilot projects in the US and in London to stop all cash purchases from shell companies of property, an attempt to stop the foreign money flowing into these places. I think Christie's, which was Jolo's auction house, where he bought a lot of art via them with stolen money, they are now asking for sellers and buyers to tell Christie's who the ultimate, you know, money is, because before you could just do everything through shell companies. But I don't think, I mean, it's very easy to get around these kind of things just by You know, I mean, for example, Jolo is able to continue to pay his lawyers in the US, you know, Schillings in London and Cobre and Kim in New York via, Jolo is shut out from the global banking system because he's on the lam, right? But he's still able to pay his lawyers because he just uses cutouts. He just uses friends, you know, friends from Harrow. He uses a Thai friend from Harrow to pay off. So very hard to stop.
Right. Shifting gears slightly, as you noted in your talk just now, the current moment is hardly a high point for democracy across much of the world, including Southeast Asia. So Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, let alone slightly off from the region, Hong Kong. So authoritarian regimes might have certain advantages when it comes to cracking down on corruption, and economic inequality and elite privilege also clearly thrive in liberal democracy. So how do you read current political trends in the region in terms of their implications for supporting or dismantling systems for accountability or anti-corruption?
Oh, it's extremely depressing. I'm sitting here in Hong Kong where, you know, obviously the rule of law is going to be undermined in the months and years ahead. It already is being. The only glimmer of hope is that protesters are brave. They realize there are such things as natural laws, and that they, you know, democracy isn't just a Western import. You know, we're seeing in Thailand very brave protesters standing up against the lèse majesté laws there. But I think the nexus of money and power, and it's, you know, it feeds into the inequality debate as well. This is why we're seeing the protests, and it's very difficult to challenge that nexus, especially when, you know, even America, which has got a better independent legal system than many countries, doesn't sanction Goldman Sachs criminally at the parent level for this kind of behavior.
How much of this, in your talk just now, you to some extent fault Western liberal democracies for not doing more, for not living up to their promise. But in fact, there's so many states implicated in any one of these networks and scandals. Is the cure a greater system or more effective system of global governance? Is it that we hope that there isn't a weak cog in the system? In other words, from a political standpoint, how do we begin to address this sort of systemic and endemic corrupt practice?
I mean, not to toot the Wall Street Journal's horn, but I think free press is an extremely important. You know, Bradley Hope was recently told by somebody in the inner workings of the American government that the DOJ would not have gotten their probe going as fast without the Wall Street Journal's coverage. You know, there's so much corruption, and it's a choice at a place like the Justice Department what you prosecute. And so I think that's the role of the free press is extremely important in uncovering this kind of malfeasance. And, you know, there's a huge question now about the Biden email, the Hunter Biden emails, right? And watching from afar, I'm not covering this, but I see that that's not really getting covered in the US, mainly because people are worried about, you know, people are pro-Biden, reporters are pro-Biden. But I think it's very important that journalists cover everything that just deserves to be covered, and that's going to be one of the main ways that you can stop this kind of corruption. Right.
And that was actually the next thing I wanted to ask you about specifically. So media, both foreign and local, can play these key roles, as you note. They can force transparency, they can encourage accountability, but at the same time, media have also changed in recent years. So how have the role of investigative journalists in different forums changed recently, whether through shifts in media freedom, which is part of that anti-democratic shift you noted, or given the proliferation of really varyingly credible social media, or of the proliferation of fake news, and more than that, of just real skepticism toward media. So just how do shifts in the media landscape affect their roles or their potential for playing this role in bringing daylight to things that really need to see that daylight?
Well, it's very, very, very important that journalists don't become pulled into the latest political, you know, trend, and it's a very difficult fine line to balance. I think one reason the Journal is such a strong media brand is that it doesn't, you know, it may sometimes play stories in a bit less sensationalist way, to other newspapers, but it doesn't sort of fall into that that the chance that it may be seen as taking sides. So that's one element of it. But very importantly, I think investigative journalism is in trouble because, and no, by the way, journalists don't call themselves investigative journalists. We're just journalists that do our work, and if we're lucky enough to come across a big story, then so be it. But you need bosses like Paul Beckett, Ken Brown, and Patrick Barger at the Journal who give you the space to do that kind of work, and you don't necessarily sell more newspapers because of it, or more subscriptions online. And you may spend years doing it, and you may pull down quite a big salary. And so the economics of that journalism, I'm just not sure, how that's going to work in the future. And that's a huge question for what you're asking about.
Mm-hmm. So clearly, part of the issue is making sure the journalists have the time, the space, the money to do what they need to do to really follow cases that might be incredibly complicated and time-consuming. But beyond that, how might states foster or encourage hard-hitting, really brave, really difficult journalism? So what sort of enabling culture or media systems or political climate does it take? And are there things we can do to foster that?
So if we're talking about, Malaysia and countries like that, then governments should just stop locking up journalists. I mean, Duterte in the Philippines, what he's doing to Maria Ressa is criminal. They're hounding her on cyber crimes, trumped up cybercrime issues, taxes, all that kind of thing. She's very bravely standing up. So, in lots of places, journalists just need to stop, governments just need to stop seeing them as the enemy. Right. But that all just comes down to like institutional building, making sure you have a free courts where you can take the government to court, right, over these free press issues. In the West, I think, this is more a personal feeling. I just feel like a lot of journalists these days are becoming politicized, and that's maybe because of social media. That they'll go on social media and they will let their individual political biases show, and that's never going to work, because if you don't like Trump, for example, you're going to be a lot better to just hit him with some amazing reporting than you are to, for example, write a story about how there was a byline fight over a New York Post story, which we've seen in the last couple of days. I just think there's much more meaty material you can get involved in that will be important. In
the book, you do go into some detail about the role of Malaysian media in really, or Claire Rucastle Brown as well, the Sarawak report. So Malaysian linked media as well. Could you say a little bit more on that balance between local media, foreign media, what you see as the specific niche or the specific advantages of both are, especially in these really multinational stories?
Yeah, if you look at the Committee to Protect Journalists, every year they put out a list of journalists killed and jailed around the world. They're always from local newspapers, often in India, places like India or Pakistan, Afghanistan. I think local journalists, and I don't know if this is quite your question, but local journalists take a lot of risk. Again, Maria, she's facing risk. Foreign journalists do too, but in some ways, foreign journalists just get thrown out of countries or have their visas cancelled, like as we've seen in China recently. So I think that local journalists, and in the 1MDB case, it was local journalists that broke the story. As you said, it was The Edge and the Sarawak report that initially broke this. The role of the international media is that we have much bigger global networks. So one way the Journal was so able to take this story forward was because I teamed up with Bradley Hope, who was a Middle East expert, and there was a huge Middle East angle to all of this. And then we had the editors, the editing capabilities that maybe the local papers don't have, to be able to make those stories more understandable and to reach a bigger global audience. And then, of course, just from it being on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, that led to, as I said earlier, the DOJ getting involved and pushing this, which it may not have done if it had just appeared in The Edge in Malaysia. So there's a sort of symbiosis there that pushed it forward.
Do you see, at least thus far, that with shrinking budgets and the economic crisis of COVID, that there might be a shift in the relative advantages or the relative capacity of different media? I mean, beyond just the obvious, all media will struggle with financial shortfalls, but does that shift the balance in some ways between local and foreign, especially given constraints on travel as well?
Well, I should just say that I left the Wall Street Journal last year. I'm no longer working there, so I don't have an inside view of that. But I don't think so. No, I think if you look at the coverage that's going on in the U.S. media, it seems to be quite strong, and that there's a lot of there seems to be subscription numbers seem to be going up for a lot of those newspapers. In the long run, I just don't know about investigative reporting. It's just such a difficult and time-consuming profession, and as I said, the links to what revenue you make from it are just not that clear. And that's why you've seen philanthropic money go into journalism, whether it was Warren Buffett or others. Right.
Shifting tack again. What's China's role, as you see it, in enabling corruption, especially through its Belt and Road projects?
Huge. They play a huge role in enabling corruption. We reported in the Wall Street Journal, use it with documents about who was involved in the corruption with Zhou Lo. So Zhou Lo was in China. He met with a guy called Sun Lijun, who was at the time China's head of domestic security forces. And we have minutes from the meeting where they discuss about how they're going to overcharge for a rail project in Malaysia, and they're going to use the money to pay off 1MDB debts. So Najib was also discussing with China about allowing the PLA Navy to dock at Malaysian ports at the time. And so it's a very naked sort of corruption. Sun Lijun has subsequently gone to jail, been arrested for corruption in China. But I don't think that the crackdown, Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption is a real one. It's just a way to get rid of people that he doesn't like, that are not in his core group. So I think China, one of the great threats to this part of the world is as China, through its Belt and Road, goes outside its borders. What does that mean for the countries of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and others? And especially as the US recedes, and especially under Trump, there's been a slightly more inward-looking policy in that regard.
Right. It's hard to see where the agency might be for really monitoring and checking that. Not only are so many countries really dependent on that investment, but also I agree with your assessment of the anti-corruption efforts in China and in many places. The question of the credibility of those efforts and really what specific goals or what political logic they embody is a really thorny one. Can journalists play a role in checking that sort of corruption? Is it not so possible just because China is involved and has little space for that? Or where do we find, what lessons have we learned that might help us better to deal with the sorts of corruption that this sort of investment in this sort of state-led campaign might introduce?
Well, let's talk about Indonesia, where you from your research, this from the KPK there was very successful in combating corruption, right, or at least in prosecuting corruption. And then there was obviously an attempt by Golkar and other politicians to undermine its work, because it's taking away the honeypot from all the corrupt politicians in Indonesia. But I think media did play a role in putting pressure on those politicians, right? And some of them have gone to jail. And I know the KPK is not perfect, and the anti-corruption drive in Indonesia is not perfect, but there is, in that country, there is an imperfect democracy. Right. But media does play a role in shining a light. And so I just think nothing's going to be perfect, but more media is better than no media. Once you get no media, then you're in trouble.
I tend to agree. I'm very conscious of time, and I want to leave you a few minutes as we conclude this component to speak a little bit more about what's next for you. So your next projects, your next initiatives. Now that you've left the journal, what should we be on the lookout for?
Oh, so yes, I'm setting up a company in Singapore called Project Brazen, which is going to do narrative nonfiction for adaptation to film and television. Have a little bit of seed capital for that. And I'm going to be moving to Singapore quite soon. Obviously, Hong Kong is challenged as a place to be in the creative business these days. And so, yeah, I'll be moving to Singapore fairly soon. And yeah, I've also just been enjoying a bit of time off and speaking about $1 Billion Whale. It was the process of doing the book was extremely exhausting and stressful, to be honest. And so yeah, I've regained my footing from having a bit of time off.
How has the reception of the book been in Hong Kong? Just as one of the places in which some of these things do tend to happen.
Well, we sold around 500,000 copies of the book in total, which is extraordinary for a book like this. About half of it was in, or maybe a third now of it has been in Asia. Most of it in Singapore, and but also the Chinese translations have sold very well in Taiwan. Obviously not in China itself, but in Taiwan and in Southeast Asia. And then the book sold very well in England because Jolo tried to stop the publication of the book by threatening bookstores. And that just led to the Streisand effect of more people getting interested in it and buying it. So
you're in his debt
it's done
now.
much better than we. Yeah. And we're making a film. We're making a film from it with SK Global, who are the makers of Crazy Rich Asians. So that's in the works. And that's something else that I'm working on with Bradley.
Okay, so you're participating in that effort.
Yes.
All right. It almost sounds like perhaps following in Jolo's footsteps, but is DiCaprio going to play a role?
Well, he may do. We don't know. We don't know that, but there may be. Who knows? I mean, maybe DiCaprio and Scorsese want to have a control in it. I don't know, but yeah, maybe. Never
know. How would you say, just as a very final question here, how has this, working on this project, on 1MDB, on Jolo, on the $1 Billion Whale, the syndrome of reporting and writing and getting the word out, how has that either changed you or differed for you from the projects you were dealing with before, which dealt with some similar themes, as we heard early on this evening, but with a different scope and a really different focus?
I've become a lot more cynical. I was already cynical to start with. If you ask my former colleagues, no, I mean, if you've lived and worked, you know this from what you've done as well, that if you've lived and worked with a focus on Southeast Asia and East Asia and South Asia, there's, you can shake a stick in any direction and you can find corruption. And I think what's changed, what I learned through the 1MDB process was just how complicit foreign institutions are in all of this. That I did not realize. I mean, I guess I had a naive view that the Western institutions had a higher standard of behavior. And I guess what I learned was that they only have a higher standard of behavior when the rules and institutions are in place to stop them behaving badly. Once they get out of that place, they will revert to the mean and behave badly. So so cynicism is, but maybe things can change, but I just don't feel so optimistic.
That's an inspiring point on which to end this segment, but I'm noticing the ticker of questions mounting. So I will turn things back to Don to open things up to questions from the floor instead of just from me.
Okay, here we go. Thank you so much for that discussion. Very illuminating. Enjoyed it a lot. We do have some questions. Let me start with the personal questions to Tom, if I may. And of course, Meredith, you feel free to dive in. So this is a three-way conversation between Tom, you, and me. Okay, the first personal question is, how did you get the emails, Tom?
The emails, well, actually, I can't, which emails are we talking about? There's like 4 sets of emails.
Well, the questioner implies that you were able to actually get the server or access the server.
Yeah, we got 4. Yes, we got 4 different sets of emails. So I don't really want to say who I got the full email server from, just because of journalistic. The person who gave it to me under, as a secret thing. So yeah, I can't really talk about that. All of the servers, the Petro Saudi servers, the Red Granite servers, the only one we can talk a little bit about is Yusuf Al Otaiba, the ambassador to the UAE servers. We got them from a group called Global Leaks. there's been a lot of questions about whether journalists should use, people often stand up in meetings that I'm at and say, well, how can you use a hacked email? So the answer to that is, well, we don't really care if they were hacked. We just care if the information in them is true. And if we're able to verify them, then, Broidy, for example, the RNC vice chairman who's pleaded guilty to helping Jolo, his emails are also hacked. And often what happens is the people who hack the emails, they give them to journalists, and then the people who were hacked admit that they were their emails. And so that's how you're able to verify that they were their emails, which is quite astounding too, if you think about it. What they often say is, well, you got it because I was hacked. But there's no law saying you can't use that information. And I think, we're fighting with a hand tied behind our back in journalism to find out what's really going on. And so as long as you can verify stuff to be true, I think it's okay to use those emails.
Mm-hmm. I would, if I could, like to pick up on your mention of Elliot Brody. Is it your impression that, let's sort of, the argument that I would make runs something like this. Basically, with the exception of Goldman Sachs, the scandal has more or less been isolated. It's something that happened far on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, involved some very corrupt people. Thank God we're not like them, and so forth, right? But Elliot Brody is a link to the Trump administration. Now, who knows what's going to happen 2 weeks from today? It's unclear. But would you want to draw a connection through Elliot Brody between what happened in Malaysia, so to speak, concentrating on Malaysia, and the political situation here in the United States? Or would you rather not touch that one?
No, there is it's about the swamp around Donald Trump, right? Of which Brody is one. So, it's astounding what happened. Jolo is in China, and he's trying to figure out a way to get the DOJ to drop its cases. Brody flies out to Shenzhen, just over the border here from Hong Kong, and meets with senior Chinese leaders arranged by Jolo. Jolo's also in the meeting. And they discuss ways in which Brody can be paid millions of dollars to help China and to help Jolo. The way he could help Jolo was to lobby Trump to get Trump to drop the investigation into 1MDB. The way he could help China, which is protecting Jolo, is to get China to send back to get the US to send back to China a guy called Guo Wengui, who is a fugitive billionaire businessman who she wants to prosecute for corruption. The president Xi Jinping wants to prosecute for corruption. And so Brody is in that nexus, trying to dealing with China. This is a Chinese influence campaign, basically, right? Chinese state influence campaign. He's dealing with Jolo. And the story is extremely complicated, but it also includes a woman called Nikki Lum Davis, who has been arrested and charged in Hawaii. She was also involved in this whole attempt to get the cases dropped in the US. Nikki Lum Davis's parents were involved in funneling money to the Clinton presidential campaign in 1996, which is a scandal called Donorgate, if anyone remembers that. And her parents were arrested and did jail time. And now she's involved in, and that was a Chinese influence campaign back in the 90s. And so, there's definitely a link between all of this and US politics. The only thing I would say is, and this is the small case for optimism, is that US politics didn't totally buckle on this case, and the prosecutions happened. And Trump did not do anything that Brody asked him to do. And Brody has now pleaded guilty to legally lobbying without announcing who he was lobbying for.
Yeah, right. So actually, that's a little bit of good news in the context of a lot of bad news. So, all right. Yeah. The next question: did you ever talk directly to Joe Low and interview him and get sort of from the horse's mouth his side of the story?
Yes, we did. We did talk to Joe Low. His lawyers. Every time you would talk to him, his lawyers would respond. But in 5 years of back and forth to Jolo via his lawyers, they did not once respond to substantively to a question. All they will say, at first they just said, well, I'm a scapegoat. It's because I'm Chinese, which is, playing on this idea that the Chinese are maltreated in Malaysia by the Malay ethnic ruling class. Then he would say, well, you're making it up at the Wall Street Journal. but no, he has never responded substantively, not to us, not on his website, not to anybody, and that's because he just cannot do so.
Okay. Next question: what will happen to Najib?
So there was a theory for a while that Najib would get away with this because of the political changes that have happened in Malaysia. The government that was elected in 2018 after he was kicked out of power has now lost power, and the people who are back in power in Malaysia are sort of closer to Najib. However, he was sentenced to 12 years in jail. Not everyone expected that. They expected the court system again to buckle under the pressure from the new government, which is more pro-Najib. However, he seems to be close to the current king, who seems to play some kind of role in all of this. And he's appealing. So, and as I said in my presentation, the amazing thing is there was a by-election, a local election, where Najib was able to turn up and campaign, even though he's a felon. You know, he's been charged and sentenced to 12 years in jail.
He's done it more than once. He's had this whole like I'm my boss campaign, boss coup, and poses with, you know, shades and a motorbike, and it's crazy.
Yeah, they're part of his Malay base in the north and the west of the country. In his home state of Pahang, they don't believe he's guilty.
Yeah,
the problem is it's a very complicated story, so it's quite hard to tell someone in an elevator pitch what happened.
Yeah, Rosma, on the other hand, seems to be commanding much less sympathy, and you don't see them together at all now.
Yes, that's right.
And another question of a personal nature from me, not from the audience. What will Project Brazen do? How will it be brazen? In what way?
Well, we're going to we had a lot of discussion about the name. We're going to uncover true stories that can form the basis of either podcasts or ebooks or adapted series or films, basically. We think there's a huge demand for content these days, and true stories really have a premium. And so I think finding stories that are both real, uncover sort of not just malfeasance, but any sort of amazing narrative threads, and then helping bring those to light.
Do you have any lined up yet that you are able to reveal?
We do, but no, not yet. It's not yet ready to reveal any.
not brazen quite yet. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, right.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Latently brazen.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Well, if I may, there are a couple of other questions. I'll get to them in just a minute. We do have enough time, I think, to deal with them, but they are very similar. I think you have stimulated a broad question in the minds of many who have heard you just now and watched you speak. And that is, what's the solution? I mean, this is sort of, the prescriptive. Meredith raised this, of course, and you've already talked about it a little bit. But maybe just for the sake of, sort of back and forth, if you will, let me play and represent some of these questions, but in my own way. I'm not representing them, word for word. Let me suggest a somewhat critical view that we should not derive too many grand inferences and conclusions from this case. That the uniqueness of this case, its scale, its sheer scale, all those handbags in the closets, right? I mean, it is absolutely spectacular, right? And so rather than say, well, this is an example, we've got to really move forward. No, in a way, perhaps it conceals a different approach to corruption, a radically different approach, which some would say is a sellout, that corruption is bad wherever it is. It's not ethical. It betrays the necessary integrity of relationships between human beings and so forth and so on. That's a kind of an absolutist view. When I first got to Jakarta to do my dissertation research, I was in a car, the driver in those days, and it's probably also true now, especially with COVID-19, very inexpensive to hire a driver. So even though I was a graduate student, I could afford a driver. And we had a tiny little Japanese car, and he would drive around. And once he turned left against the law, which said you cannot turn left, okay? And immediately a policeman blew his whistle. And I thought to myself, oh my God, you know, I'm gonna go to court and I'll, you know, the Ford Foundation is gonna be upset because they, you know, they paid for my research. But what happened was that Jailani, that was his name, wonderful guy, he just reached in his back pocket and pulled out some cash and lowered the window and handed the cash out. And that was it. And I said, wait a minute, Jailani, no, what are you doing? You're contributing to corruption in Indonesia, blah, 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 you know? And yet, the more I thought about that, especially if I had been in Jailani's position, he was much more vulnerable than I was. If they took him to court, who knows what would happen, right? Is it possible to say that micro corruption actually does grease the skids, especially in low-income countries where people really can't afford to deal with the formal law? Or is that a cop-out?
That's a total cop-out. I totally disagree that small-scale corruption greases the wheels. I lived for 7 years in Jakarta in 2 postings, and there was a left turn to our office that was illegal that you had to do to get to our office. And my driver paid millions of rupees of fines, which is not millions of dollars of fines, over the years. So I think how I would answer that is to say that, you know, in societies where the leaders are corrupt, and you see the Roswell Mansours with $250 million of loose items in their house, you get a whataboutism approach from everybody in that country. And I'm not just talking about, you know, your driver, Don. I'm talking about, you know, I've been offered backdated IPO shares when I worked at the Wall Street Journal. You know, a businessman said to me, I've got this IPO that happened, and do you want $20,000 US of shares? And by the way, you can have it at the IPO price, but the share's gone up 4 times, right? And so that kind of behavior becomes endemic. And I think that all you're seeing at the grassroots is a society where corruption is allowed. And, you know, that could be a fear for America, right? If you allow swamp behavior and people like Elliot Broidy to become entrenched around the government, and they don't get weeded out, then you could start to see corruption at you know, on the streets with police cars and motorists in America. And the fact you don't is a testament to how the system is better, right? Yeah. That's how I would put it.
Meredith, do you want to comment on that, Meredith?
I mean, I tend to agree. I think part of the issue with tolerating the small scale corruption is we can understand the effects differently. So the more macro level corruption may have distinct corrosive effects and really undermine political institutions in really important ways. But even that micro level corruption still perpetuates and exacerbates forms of inequality. You know, what may be a small amount is still something. There might be insider outsider networks. And then more to the point, it also takes the pressure off states to pay police officers correctly, or to fund services and to do the things that they need to do, such that petty corruption, you know, the do it kopi or whatever it's called in different places, you know, the coffee money, isn't something on which, you know, your average traffic cop actually relies to make ends meet. And so it really shifts the burden back onto the average citizen, and at the same time does really leave people, I think, disenchanted with the system, or just distrustful. It hollows out. I had a student who wrote an excellent PhD thesis, and I'm just going to borrow from right now and say it hollows out institutions. It becomes easier to go pull a string if you happen to know somebody, but then what about the people who don't know somebody? In the meantime, you don't have functioning systems. And so that's part of the problem. But at the same time, you know, as we were discussing earlier, anti-corruption efforts may not do what they're supposed to do. They may be more about political vendettas, or more about, you know, using just a different form of string pulling as opposed to a way of really eradicating corruption per se.
Yeah. Okay, well, as you know, I'm playing devil's advocate. I don't necessarily believe what I'm saying, but I think it's useful to at least put it on the table because, you know, frankly, resources are scarce in a developing country. And if you want to address corruption, it seems to me that you're not going to start with micro corruption engaged in by people who can, you know, barely afford to put food on the table, who may not even have a table to put food on, right? You want to start with the big guys. In that sense, people like Joe Low making, you know, I don't know what the effects of this are in Malaysia among ordinary people. Do they look at what happened to Najib and so forth and say, oh my God, they got what they deserved, and I'm not gonna mess around in any kind of corruption. I have no idea. But there are scales of corruption, and you don't want to start at the bottom. You want to start at the top. And then when you get in the middle, there's some ambiguity, I guess I would suggest. Now, one of the questions from the audience was this. Tom, you said that in the future, no one will use email to engage in corrupt activity. And I don't know if you meant that that's good news because the questioner thought it might be bad news, because that would mean we will have encrypted corruption, right? Yeah. Which will be unbreakable. And it'll be much worse. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that totally. I mean, it's a miracle how much information we got because of email servers. Tim Leisner, the Goldman partner, he was a bit more savvy. He kept everything off email. I mean, I think amongst Wall Street bankers, they say, let's not put this on email. Let's meet. Let's have a coffee. Leisner had some dealings with dodgy dealings with Jolo on his Gmail. And he later married Kimora Lee Simmons, the reality TV star. And Kimora's personal assistant forwarded that email from his Gmail into his Goldman account. And that was the email that got him fired from Goldman because he was trying to get Jolo a bank account. So that was a lucky break in the story for us because that got Leisner fired and then we found out more about him. But yes, you can keep all of this off email. You can do it all in person and you can keep it in the shadows.
Yeah, right. Next question. Will COVID-19 worsen corruption in Asia or make it better or have no effect?
I don't have a view on that, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, okay. Why would COVID have an effect on corruption? It's already pretty bad anyway. I'm not sure.
I could suggest that I mean, there have been cases already of, just because of the scale and the speed of relief packages, of finding ways either to claim credit. I mean, we see this in the US as well, for aid without really deserving that credit. So whether it be prescription cards with the president's name on it that are distributed, but we find that in Asia as well, or just the more funds that run through systems that really aren't designed necessarily for the rapid deployment of that much money, the easier it is to skim. But that's not necessarily changing something systematically. That's more opportunistic skimming, rent seeking when there's a rent to be sought, but it might not change the nature or the prevalence of corruption in a longer term perspective.
Well, here's what let me provide a little tiny factoid here. Okay, so in April, Reporters Without Borders said that in 38 countries, I don't know which ones and how many of them were in Asia, I'm not sure. In 38 countries, COVID-19, the pandemic, was used by the government, by the authorities, as an excuse to arrest journalists, to harass journalists, to suppress the free press. Yeah. Okay. And later on, I don't know when, maybe in September, maybe a month ago, Freedom House issued a statistic that number had gone up to 91. It had more than doubled, right? So that you could argue that insofar as shutting down an economy, although it looks good maybe from a medical point of view, it's disastrous obviously from an economic point of view, that shutting down an economy emboldens the people who want the power to be able to do that. And while they're at it, do some other things, including, curtailing the opportunity to learn true facts rather than fake ones from the media, right? So that would be the argument, I think, that would be, I don't know how you feel about that, Tom, but that's at least one point of view.
I hadn't thought about that, but that sounds totally credible and worrying, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree.
Now, the next thing, we do have maybe a couple of minutes, and I don't want to dominate this. Meredith, if you have any questions you want to ask further, please feel free. Of the major powers in Southeast Asia, Japan has the best reputation by far. And I can defend that, there's a lot of evidence, you may be aware of it, opinion polling and so forth. And Japan, on the issue, for example, of infrastructure, is noted for its effort to develop what they call quality infrastructure, which means good economic governance, which means reducing the level of corruption in initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So it seems to me, I don't know how you feel about this, but would it be possible for Japan in cooperation with other democratic countries? I don't know if the Quad, the famous, combination of Japan, the US, Australia, and India, because India is pretty corrupt, but still, would it be possible to use Japan in some manner to try to reduce corruption, especially when it comes to infrastructure, where frankly, I think, if I may say so, that's a major opportunity for all kinds of things, under the table payments, side payments, and so forth. Would it make sense to single out infrastructure and not do this in a sense of sort of anti-China, but rather pro-honesty for Japan and others to do this, including international institutions that could be brought on board? Does that make sense?
It would make sense. The only problem is that Japan has been supplanted by China as the main purveyor of infrastructure in Southeast Asia. Obviously, Thailand's whole Ranong industrial base was constructed in the 70s and 80s by Japan, right? And now, I wrote about this when I was at the Journal. Now, if you go to Cambodia or it's China that's building the roads down through Yunnan, down connecting southern China to that part of the world. And I just don't see Japan as being a credible counterbalance to that. But you're right; it is still an infrastructure player through JITCO and others in Southeast Asia, and it does do its projects in a much more even-handed way. With at least they do open tenders and all that kind of thing.
Right.
But no, I think China's got a lot more money, and that's the problem.
Well, by my clock, I think we're out of time. And so let me hand this back to Giwook. And I must say, before I go, thank you so much. That was a very stimulating presentation. And thank you, Meredith, for your participation. Very, very helpful.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, Giwook, I think you're here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tom, Meredith, Don, for fascinating discussions on a very important topic. And it's really our pleasure to have all of you join us this evening. And Tom, congratulations again. And we look forward to your movie, hopefully quite soon. And I also like to thank everyone who made this evening possible, including our selection committee and also our communication team, led by Noah Ronkin and Melissa, Amanda, Denise, and Calista, and all of us. And also, I'm once again very grateful for the ongoing support of the Shorenstein family, and the legacy of Walter Shorenstein continues. So thanks again for joining us, and good night.